today I got the chance to sit down and talk with Andrew Braunberg. Andrew is very educated on the history of Texas whiskey. We talked about how much more incomprehensibly drunk people were in the 17 and 1800s, how difficult distilling was, many of the mechanics of making a good whiskey, the temperance laws and prohibition, and much more. Now please sit back and learn a bit more about the lighter side of history with Andrew Braunberg. Hello and welcome to the Arsenic Show. Today I have Andrew Braunberg. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well.
Thank you for coming down.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So you have kind of an interesting backstory. I did not know any of this before I was thinking about your book and reading your book. But you actually are more in my world than you are in this world in some ways. And
we've got some common friends.
We
definitely.
sure do. We sure do. So, well, I think that's worth spending a couple minutes on.
Sure.
So how did you get into cybersecurity? And
You know, I think folks get in, well, first of all, I should say through being an analyst. So I'm a research analyst, market analyst. And I think folks tend to go into that business either as a practitioner or a journalist. And I actually came from a journalist background. So that's kind of how I worked my way. But I started doing security in 2003. It's been just about 20 years. Yeah, it's been a ride.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 28 years. This is very strange to me because we're here to talk about whiskey, and and so this is kind of odd that we just strange confluence.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So, where do you work now?
I work for Omdia, which is an analyst house that headquartered out of the UK. It's got a lot of they've acquired a lot of parts. It reports up into Informatech. And
Black Hat.
Black Hat's a sister company. Dark Reading's a sister company.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the analytical components came from places like Ovum, if anyone remembers those guys. So it's a nice mix of quantitative, qualitative, and then the events, and then the side that really gets you into where the CISOs are hanging out on the in the end users. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And so, what is the day like for an analyst? I got to know. What do you spend most of your time doing?
Yeah, it really depends. So we're more of a what we'd call a supply side analyst house, which means we write mostly for vendors. So it's not as if I were, if you're working at Gardner or maybe Forrester, you're probably spending most of your days doing end user inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
This is more, we've got a calendar of reports we're writing. They're targeted to a specific sector that we're within our wheelhouse, and it's a lot of research and a lot of writing. So it's the same kind of thing I did kind of writing the book. Being an analyst for me was very similar to being an author of nonfiction.
So the journalistic tools in your war chest were very useful.
Absolutely, yeah. Almost complete mapping.
Wow,
I should say.
That's great.
Yeah.
So. Okay, so you're doing computer security analyst work, and you decide I want to get into whiskey. How'd you get from point A to point B? It's a pretty big stretch. I mean, I'd say that a lot of security people like whiskey, but that's one step further.
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny because there is exactly a connection, which was I was going out to RSA one year, and this goes back to, I don't know, we're probably going back to like 2010. And I'm working for another analyst house at the time. And I've got a bunch of coworkers there who are big Scotch drinkers. Mm-hmm. We got a little Scotch club at work. I think a lot of folks did before remote was kind of the way people. And so we were always kind of keeping each other up on new whiskeys, but again, mostly Scotches. But then I had this guy send me this article, and it had come out in the San Francisco Chronicle, actually. And it was about white whiskeys.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, white whiskeys, huh? Now, again, this is almost 15 years ago. So I'm like, well, what? So come to find out, you've got these American craft distillers that are kind of coming onto the scene, which is something I didn't really know much about. Again, I'd been spending my time thinking about Scotches for 10 years or so. And the way the economics of that business work, it's not like you can just start up a distillery, say I'm making whiskey, and then come back 10 years later and say, here's my 10-year-old Scotch, right? So these guys were releasing what they call white whiskeys. We kind of, most people would think they would be reminiscent of a moonshine, right? Because they're going to be clear, and that's why they call them white.
And that's mostly because they haven't spent any time in barrels.
They have not spent any time in wood at all, right? So it's something pretty foreign to a lot of folks. I mean, there's other, traditional clears that are, but not so much in the whiskey space. So I said, well, it ended up, there was a bar they recommended in San Francisco that they said had a lot of them that were worth trying. And since I was going out for RSA anyway, I just went out that Sunday before the show. I head down to this bar, and I walk in, and it's given off, the place is giving off a real day drinking vibe, but there's really no one in there. There's one older guy sitting at the bar drinking PBR out of a can, and that's the Sunday afternoon scene, man. So I figure, well, at least the bartender's gonna be happy to help me out, right? Yeah. So I go up, and I mentioned the article, and hey, what's with all these white whiskeys and everything? The bartender couldn't care less, man. He kind of pretended he was gonna find what I was looking for, and long short, I was about to just kind of walk out of the place thinking I wasn't going to get my tasting in. Mm-hmm. And so this old guy pops up off the bar, and he walks around.
The PBR guy?
Yeah, the PBR guy. Yeah, it's pretty much just us in there. And he waves the bartender off. And so I figure he owns the place, right? I mean, well, how's he, well, anyway, long short, he did not own the place. He was kind of a roving ambassador for the American Distilling Institute, which becomes important here in a minute of this kind of drawn out story. But so he starts pulling them. He knows where they all are. He pulls them down. He sets them up with a flight. We kind of walk through him. We're talking about and he's very knowledgeable because the ADI at that time was really the only kind of umbrella group trying to represent craft distillers in the United States. And so I'm learning a ton, like in just an hour, right? Mm-hmm. I'm kind of like trying these different products that I didn't know about, seeing all these different distilleries. They're from all over the country, which is really fascinating to me. They're not great, but you could kind of feel like you could get used to them. Like I remember.
In what way? Just very
well, you got to change. You got to change your expectation, right? Uh-huh. Because oak provides at least 50% of the overall flavor in a typical American whiskey, right? And so a lot of people, that's exactly what they're expecting, and that's what they prefer. But another conversation we can have is, is that really the right flavor profile that, a new American whiskey should be shooting for? Mm. I mean, in my mind, we could probably pull back a lot of that oak flavor and think about some of the different flavor components that come into an American whiskey. Or, well, grains, being the next obvious one, right? But anyway.
Or types of sugar is probably another one.
Yep. There's just different, there's different ways we could think about what a whiskey should taste like. And the regionality conversation is another really important part of this. But, so that in itself was like really interesting. But then this guy ends up, his name's Dino. Dino says, hey, we're doing a book signing later in the week. Why don't you come back? We'll get you in the back and you can hang out. And this guy had written a book, it's called Chasing the White Dog, and it was about his adventures back on the East Coast and Moonshine and in southwestern Virginia. Pretty interesting read. He was there kind of just talking about kind of that crazy moonshiner kind of experience. It was still going on, even probably still is today in that part of the country. But what really blew me away was they had 4 or 5 craft distillers that were there doing pours, and they were just doing some really amazing, you could tell, first of all, none of them were trying to be Kentucky whiskey. They were just doing the things that made sense where they were. And so they had one of them.
What does that mean?
Well, you think about what the regionality in the area that you're in, and what might make sense. It might not be whiskey. And so there was an example of a little distillery in Grand Junction, Colorado. And Grand Junction had a long, since it was founded, over 100 years, it had been a fruit producing region. So they were making these different, fruit based.
It's like brandies almost.
Yeah, fruit, different brandies, even a grappa, right? And I just thought, wow, who would have thought to do this kind of like just I'm going to start a grappa company, It just seemed very innovative to me. And so that's part of the interest was just like, well, what sugars do you have to work with? That's always the distiller's going to try to figure out, like what can I ferment and then what can I distill, right? And the Texas history is interesting that way too, right? The Spanish initially, who were distilling in Texas 400 years ago, were growing grapes down on the Rio Grande. They would make wine and they'd distill that into brandy. The first, during the Austin colony in early Anglo-Texas, they were trying to make sugar plantations. So they're going to try to make rum from that if they've got an excess. So it really just depends, what you've got to work with. But there were some decent whiskeys too. I mean, none of them obviously were that old, but it got me thinking about regionality. And I'd been mostly, in my mind, whiskey was Scotch. And the neatest thing in my mind about Scotch was always that there were these different little regional, Highland and Lowland, you've got very different flavor profiles. And so I came back from that just completely fixated on the idea of trying to do a little home distillation. And so I did that. And again, so that's, 2010-ish. I'm doing that for a couple of years, and then
How legal is that, actually? I have no idea if that's legal.
This isn't going to get broadcast.
Of course, just tens of thousands of people. It's fine.
I should say it's definitely not.
Yeah,
it's definitely not legal. But
interesting. But it seems. But you can do breweries. I mean, you can distill, or you can brew beer, which is seems odd.
Well, there's a couple reasons. One, and this is another interesting kind of conversation to have at some point, but the tax structure around alcohol has always been strongest around spirits, and the amount of money the federal government's made since the Civil War on taxing spirits is just absolutely amazing, and by far the most regulated industry in America. Between 1865, at the end of the Civil War, and Prohibition, well, you can't go that far. Maybe up until the Food and Drug Act in 1906. No industry is regulated anywhere near to the degree that spirits are, and beer to a lesser degree, because of the tax money they want for it, right? Mm-hmm. And so even pharmaceuticals, they're not trying to put any kind of regulations around it. But the regulations around alcohol were very much geared towards simply tax revenue and not adulteration or anything else, or trying to reduce. You could say, well, the tax is there to reduce consumption. No, not that either, right? So, but anyway, I do that for a couple years, maybe not fully legally, and moved to Austin in 2012, at which point my wife and I almost immediately meet up with another couple who have a very similar scheme, and that's kind of, where things take off.
How did you meet them?
We were living in I'd come down to work for NSS Labs, which is out in Westlake here in Austin. We were just, at the time, for the first couple of years, we were just coming down kind of winter, spring, and we were in Santa Fe at the time, and we didn't want to sell the house. So we do 6 months. And
Santa
so
Fe
anyway.
is beautiful.
Yeah, very nice, and beats summer in Austin. Yeah. Forgive me, but absolutely.
No,
right?
You don't have to.
Yeah.
No apologies needed.
We're those Texans running up.
It's been over 100 degrees all week, so.
It's been pretty brutal. So we were just renting an apartment downtown in one of the towers, met a couple in the elevator, started kind of having dinner with them. These were relatives of those folks and they were kind of snowbirding too. So, yeah.
Similar.
Yeah.
So why don't we start talking about the book? Like, how did you get the idea that this is something you wanted to write?
I guess the easy answer is, there's a couple answers to that. The quickest one is right when Still Austin finally launched, which was 2017. Mm-hmm. I read an article in Texas Monthly called "The Great Texas Whiskey Boom," and it had a line in there from a pretty well-known spirits historian, Michael Beach, that said basically Texas never had a pre-Prohibition whiskey history on the production side. No, they never had a registered.
That doesn't sound right.
Well, right? That can't be right. I mean, exactly, right? And that's exactly, like, I put it down and I thought, two things. One, that can't be right. And why do they need to call Beach up in Louisville to ask him that question, right? Is there not a Texas historian that they could have called? I mean, come on, it's Texas Monthly. And it ends up there probably wasn't because... and so I'm not trying to dog Beach. He's a good historian. He writes a lot of good stuff, but again, he's got a focus in Kentucky. And so I started, that was one germ. Like, well, let me just, peel that back. Well, one thing I come to find out is that Dan Garrison, who had the first registered post-Prohibition whiskey distillery out in High, had put up a sign in front of his distillery that said first legal whiskey distillery in Texas.
Huh.
Right? He thought the same thing. He didn't know, and Dan's an old Texan, right? So I mean, now I'm thinking, well, no one knows this history, right? But I had been doing at the time for the couple years before Still Austin opened its doors. I was kind of running production in the back, kind of. Operations manager kind of thing, and helping the head distiller to think about kind of what our product portfolio should be. And we're thinking very much, and again, in my mind, the interesting part of all this is thinking about regionality. What's a Texas whiskey supposed to taste like? What's the mash bill, particularly? Mm-hmm. How long is it going to have to age? All those things got to be rethought when you come into this environment. And Texas has got just this tremendous agricultural history, which I guess most people know, but back pre-Prohibition, it was there was a lot of wheat being grown, and now it's I think a lot more corn, and nothing wrong with that for whiskey, obviously, but a lot of soft wheats back then. Some rye. The only thing that oat grows great in Texas. The only thing that doesn't grow really too well is probably barley. Up in the Panhandle, it's got to be a little cooler and drier. And so, I was doing research just to look into some of those old heirloom grains, kind of the heritage there. To try to figure out, well, let's see if we can find out what folks were producing back then. Because again, in my mind, it wasn't even a question like, of course someone was making whiskey back then. It was just a matter of tracking them down, right? And so first step, though, was really finding out what were the grains that were being grown in Texas. And that at least gives you a roadmap for what was in the realm of the possible.
Mm-hmm. And so from there, you're like, okay, it's time to write a book. Like now you've got this kind of corpus of information, or ready to go.
I had a lot of background knowledge there that had been kind of, and then when I left the day-to-day operation at Still Austin, which was 2020-ish. I had a little more free time on my hands, so I figured, why don't I think about kind of putting this together and see how much is there? Is there a book there, or is there an article there? And you know how that goes. 18 months later, I'm like, oh hell yeah, this is a book. I'm almost there. I've got it. And yeah, and that was pretty much, that was pretty much it.
So not to jump ahead too much, but what were the reactions from the various historians around that got our hands on it?
Yeah, that's a good question, because one, let me back up on that one for a minute. The idea that which I kind of alluded to, was that, a lot of that history had been lost, and no one knew. Even Dan Garrison didn't know. But another way to look at it is it was erased, right? It wasn't lost. It was consciously, just written out of the history. And I think when you look at a lot of those, you kind of think about, when Texas kind of came into its own independence and then statehood, you can kind of line up to where, when a lot of those, a really nice resource when you start drilling down, is the county histories. And Texas, Texas loves its history, right? For the non-Texans and the audience, I mean, the Mayflower band's got nothing on the old 300 in Texas. I mean, those original families. You mention any of these old guys, and I guarantee someone will go, by the way, I'm related to him. And so you can find someone in the record, and you can be really sure, this guy was a distiller, right? But then when you go back and you look to try to drill in, especially at the county level, it'll say something weird like, he went off to, Lamar County for a couple years and ran a business. They'll never mention
which business,
right?
Huh.
So you've got to have some other information to even figure out, is that the guy I'm really looking for? Well, he owned a mill, and that's kind of a tell, right? Because there was that, frontier bit there. So anyway, that was part of the problem. So that's kind of one interesting kind of complication about writing. I guess it'd be like writing about vice. If you were trying to write the history of vice in Dallas, it might be a little tricky too. But then once you get it written, and I guess that is a segue into vice, the publisher I had was is an academic publisher, and they kind of roll up in the Texas A&M press is basically what it is. And I did get a little pushback from them, not in a bad way. They weren't trying to censor me necessarily, but making suggestions around kind of how some of this history might make Texas look. And I think still.
And what was the implication? What do they mean? Look, what does that mean?
Well, that maybe it wasn't putting the best face on Texas, right? I mean, that history of gambling, drinking, violence, it's all part of the story, right? And to me, it kind of, in a lot of ways, is a more interesting part of the story, right? 100%.
So for anyone who has not read this, I think it's actually kind of makes Texas look kind of romantic and interesting, because I think there's a predisposition for people to think, it was just a bunch of cowboys and plains and that was it. But there was a lot of things going on in the States, wars and, various different taxation issues causing all kinds of downstream effects of people kind of scurrying around, making new businesses, destroying the businesses. I mean, this is a very deep thing. And this is as interesting from a historical perspective as any historical thing I've ever read. And yes, obviously, it had to do with prostitution, and yes, it had to do with gambling, and yes, it had to do with, cowboy rustlers and all kinds of different versions of bad characters. But it was also just every person in Texas was a drinker for the most part. I mean, it was. You had some crazy stats in there. I wish I had written it down.
Oh, I probably remember a couple of them.
Go ahead.
Well, the first thing that I think everyone's got to keep in mind is that the absolute height of drunkenness in North America was the 1830s. I mean, you can look at the numbers,
which is surprising. Actually,
it's surprising.
I mean, I feel like I know enough people who drink constantly. We've got to be in the running, but apparently not.
I think there's a quote or two in there, from some established historians that will say basically everybody on the frontier was drunk all the time, and I don't think that was too far from the truth in the 1830s. And of course, Texas, was founded in the 1830s as far as, winning independence. And so you've got, for example, Sam Houston, who's a famous early Texan, his Native American name was Big Drunk. It translated into Big Drunk. I mean, and there's, I think I've got a quote in there, where they compare Houston to Lamar and some of those other early governors and lieutenant governors, etc. And they're like, just, even Houston drunk in a ditch is better than these other guys. I mean, he had a really strong following. And so I think that level of just acceptance of drunkenness was very, very different.
So what are we talking about? How much more drunk was the 1830s than the 2000s?
If you look at the numbers, so on average, it's about a 3x. It's about a 3x addition. Now, does that, I think there's only so much people can drink. So, right? I mean, the numbers in there would be, you're going to be at least drinking 10 or 12 drinks
daily.
a day. Oh yeah.
And that's every day. That's
every day.
That's not a bender.
No.
That's just a Tuesday.
A bender. A bender would be a 24-hour. You're drinking a lot more than that. So I think what you have to assume is just a much larger percentage of the population was drinking to that level. And I remember they were self-medicating too, right? Both physically and mentally, I'm sure. So
that's a good point. Medicine had not exactly caught up by that point.
Yeah, and alcohol and whiskey particularly was considered medicinal, really up till Prohibition. I mean, there's a bit of a funny story where the American Medical Association, or the equivalent, I forget if they were actually around then, they probably were, had declassified whiskey as medicinal until Prohibition hit, and then someone decided, hold on, I see a loophole and a moneymaker for us, and medicinal whiskey came back and was their pharmacists and doctors made quite a lot of money off of that. That was one of several big loopholes in the Bloodshed Act.
Pharmacists making money off of the population, medicating them any way they can for hundreds of years.
Absolutely. Now that's not to say there wasn't a strong prohibitionist element that ran through Texas history, and it's really interesting to me that Steve Austin, so the Austin colony, was the really he's considered the father of modern Texas, right? Because he got that colony started after his father died. And again, I mentioned the original 300. So these 300 families that came as the original colonists. One of them was Martin Varner, and he had a sugar plantation he started up down outside of West Columbia, and he was successful enough that he had enough additional molasses to try to make some rum, and he thought that was great. He thought, and he was proud of it enough that he sent a bottle to Steve Austin to, I think, try to get his blessing. In the letter that Austin sent back to Varner and his partner Israel Walters is quite a read. I mean, clearly, Austin would rather choke this guy than have him making, spirits in Texas. And it's a long letter, and he finally comes around after really, really dogging him about, how the lowest form of folks or producers of ardent spirits, as they'd call them back then. But at the end, he makes that pragmatic turn that you see quite a bit in the history of spirits in Texas, where he says, yeah, but, it would be so great if people wouldn't drink in Texas, but damn if I know a way to keep them from doing it. So again, if there's a revenue opportunity here for Texans, maybe we should take it. And so even at that, really
very pragmatic, even pre-independence, right? And then again, you'll see that, right? You'll see that all the way up until, and so by the 1890s, 1900, which is still, a fair way away from national prohibition, which isn't until 1919, a lot of Texas has already dried out, and they're doing it county by county. That seems very odd to me. So they really wanted to shut it down, but why? Are they worried about people just falling down drunk in the middle of the street? Like what was the day like for an average person in that time frame?
Yeah, I think it depends on exactly when in that time frame. I think when you're talking, pre-Civil War, I think it's more just the absolute drunkenness, right? So you'll see when folks are moving out they're moving out on the further into the plains, further into that frontier, if we were calling it that. It's very common for the folks that move into that new area to get together and form a temperance group even before they'll think about putting a church up, right? Really the first thing they think about is, how are we going to handle drunkenness in this new community, right? And that to me is just strictly about a severe level of alcoholism going on with a lot of people, right? Wow. Now that's very different. Once Texas is more settled, the conversation shifts very much to the vices that tend to surround saloons, right? And that's so I think there's really, and we can probably make the split at the Civil War, right? Before then, it's more about just moving into new spaces and really working temperance as opposed to prohibition, right? It's moral suasion. How are we gonna just keep people from drinking just because we're gonna try to make them feel like it's ostracizing them from the community. I would say, one really interesting bit as we move, post-Civil War and really start trying to move towards prohibition, that Texas ends up, even with all their success with local option laws, when national prohibition finally hits, they're one of the few ex-Confederate states that actually hadn't got a full statewide prohibition in place. So, they dried out all the rural areas, but there's these urban strongholds where they just can't make any headway, and they can never win the popular vote statewide. And it's interesting because I think temperance, again, as opposed to prohibition, worked really well in a lot of communities. I mean, the German Americans, they thought it was just a joke to think about prohibition. They had a vote, one of the constitutional amendment votes they did in the 1880s. The voting records are still there in New Braunfels. Zero votes for passing this thing out of hundreds of people in that German
love the
town.
Germans.
Right. But I think the Mexican Americans were the same way. I think again, temperance worked well in a lot of those communities, right? But for a lot of the Appalachian folks coming in, and particularly in that northeast part of Texas, they were very much driven to look for another solution, and that was prohibition. And what happened was it became an easier argument to make as the number of saloons really multiplied. From like the 1870s through to say 1900. Yeah, there were a lot of saloons, and you could tie a lot of violence and gambling, certainly to a lesser degree prostitution, to these establishments, and that became the way to kind of turn the middle class against the idea of alcohol at all.
So this actually kind of surprised me. I didn't realize there was actually vice areas, like sort of designated places inside these larger cities where this was sort of, this happens and everyone just kind of looks the other way.
Oh, absolutely.
So
and every
how did that come about?
Well, I mean, I kind of joke in the book. It's so, proper people know how to avoid it and everyone else knows where to find it. I think that's honestly not probably far from the truth, but literally even, kind of Waco size, certainly Houston, Galveston, they've all got these areas, and the interesting thing is that for the bigger towns, I forget exactly, but I think Houston and Dallas, I remember for sure, for a time had thought about just completely legalizing those areas, right? And so most of the time they're just kind of in a gray zone, and it's like Hell's Half Acre in Fort Worth was probably the most famous of them. And just had this, certainly statewide reputation as just a place you really, you didn't want to just wander in there unawares, that's for sure. Yeah, I think it was probably the best if you were trying to limit this kind of activity. Probably the best you could hope for was that it would at least be bounded in a way that you could reasonably avoid it if you wanted to.
So I think it'd be worth now talking a little bit about the the mechanics of alcohol. So can you tell me the difference between like bourbon and rye and whiskey versus Scotch, et cetera? Like, can you kind of like, how do you clearly define and distinguish them, either from your palate or how they're made?
Yeah, it's really, it sounds complicated because we've got these things called standards of identity, and it sounds like, oh, okay, that sounds like it's a long list of things. It's really not. I mean, you start, the highest level is whiskey. Whiskey is any product distilled from a fermented grain, right? And so grains cover a fair amount of different categories or agricultural products. So corn, wheat, rye, oats, I mean, anything that falls into that could theoretically become whiskey. And so in the U.S., we've got several standards of identity, as I say. The most well-known is going to be bourbon. And bourbon is now the main requirement is, again, around that mash bill, we would call it, which is what grains are we using to produce that we're going to ferment and then distill. And so for a bourbon, the mash bill, the recipe, if you will, it's got to be at least 51% corn. And then the rest of it we can talk about. But that's the main thing, right? And so you're going to take some amount of grains, you're going to mix them together, you're going to basically make beer out of it, right?
So a bourbon is a whiskey, then?
A bourbon is a subcategory of whiskey, correct. Okay. A rye, same thing. It would be a subcategory. As long as it's made with grains, unless we start talking about Taft, the Taft decision, which will get a little more complicated.
Sure, we can talk about
that. But that's that's pre-prohibition. But yeah, so your American whiskeys identities would be bourbon, corn whiskey, and so corn whiskey would be 80% corn or above. And now, which brings up another...
Which would probably be sweeter, I'd imagine.
A little bit sweeter, and it's sweeter for another reason, because corn whiskey is the only one of these where you don't have to put it in new American oak, right? It can go in a used barrel. So it's not going to pull as many of the tannins. It's not going to get... Like if you put that corn whiskey in a used bourbon barrel, that barrel's already kind of sweet as it is, and all that extra corn's going to make it even sweeter, right? So then you could have a rye whiskey, again, another subclass of just American whiskey, or a wheat whiskey. Now, where it gets a little more complicated is you probably heard of a high rye bourbon. Well, what's that, right? So what you've got in any American whiskey is a secondary grain. So you've got that primary grain that's going to be the designation, either bourbon, corn whiskey, rye. And then you've got the secondary grain, which they call a flavor grain. And the flavor grain is going to usually just add another note to that whiskey. So in bourbon...
What percentage of it is that flavored grain?
Yeah, so that's the secret sauce, right, for a lot of these distillers. The only other thing that's typically put in there, and this is more for historic reasons, is a little bit of malted barley. And the malted barley, again, historically was put there because barley has more enzymes that can convert those starches from the grains into simple sugars that can be fermented. The yeast can't ferment starch molecules. We got to splice them up a little bit into sugars, simpler sugars, and then the yeast can do its work. So you've always got 5 or 10% of malted barley in there, just historically, and that tends to still be the case, even though you can add additional enzymes that have been kind of isolated now. So let's say we need at least 50+% of your main grain and 10 of this of barley. So that leaves you 40% to play with. But that's typically much more than most folks would use. So again, a high rye bourbon would probably have less than 20% rye as your flavor grain. Probably have 65-70% corn in it, and then that rye is going to give it those spicy notes, and then a little bit of malted barley on the back end. It's kind of would be a very typical.
That sounds pretty sweet as well. Yeah,
it would be pretty sweet, and it's interesting because for a lot of ryes, they tend to be much more like a MGP is a kind of a famous a distiller that sources out to a lot of other distilleries. And they had a rye that they sold quite a bit that was 95% rye and 5% barley, so no flavor, but if rye is your leader, then it's kind of hard to match a flavor grain of that. So they basically do, I guess it's harder to complement that rye flavor than it is to add a flavor to corn, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So if you wanted an even sweeter something, you would do a wheated bourbon, right? And so there's a lot of wheated bourbons that people like quite a bit, but they've certainly got a softer taste than.
What about just adding more sugar into the mash, more molasses or whatever?
Yeah, for an American whiskey, that's not allowed. All the sugar has to come from that converted grain.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, anything that had sugar in it would either be, just like a simple moonshine, or if you're thinking broadly about sugar, maybe a rum, right? If it was molasses or cane sugar.
Sure. Yeah. Interesting. And so how is that different from like Irish or Scotch whiskey? Yeah.
So they've got their own standards of identity, which I don't know as well, but Scotch is a completely different animal in that it's going to be completely malted barley, right? So Scotch is all malted barley, and then they'll occasionally do what they call grain whiskeys. If they're making a blend, maybe they could use something that had some corn or some wheat in it. The Irish whiskey, I honestly don't know what a typical Irish whiskey mash bill looks like. We know that the flavor profiles, though, right? They tend to be softer. They'll distill them down. I think they'll distill them at a higher proof, which actually is one other thing I should mention about the standards of identity. So then another question might be, what's the difference between vodka and in whiskey? And on the vodka front, it's not so much the grain or the sugar they're using; it's the degree of distillation when they make it, right? So what they're trying to do is to make basically a neutral spirit, and so they can use any grain, or they can use, any sugar that they want to. And we know there's wheat vodkas, there's beet vodkas, there's potato vodka, right? I mean, but they need to distill it at least at 190 proof, which is pretty pure.
And then they cut it clearly. There's no way that stays that high.
Yeah. They'll put it down to a bottling proof. But so in comparison, for American whiskey, you can't pull an American whiskey off higher than 165 proof, right?
Is that a nature of the yeast or something? Or?
No, that's just that they don't want you to pull too much of those flavors out of it. They don't want it to be vodka, right? And so there's this, how much of the funk should be left in there, basically, that you're going to have to age out later, right? And then that's a big part of the art to it, right? So you distill it at, anywhere, I think, between, there might not be a lower bound, actually, now I think about it. But you don't want it to be, if you move up too high, and it might be 160 proof. Apologies, kind of having a blanket on that. 160, 165. Above that, it becomes a light whiskey designation, which some people make, but it's not a real popular. It would be kind of a lighter sipper, right? But basically, what folks do is they
That'd
distill.
be pretty darn strong. Over 160 proof.
Yeah, but again, that's just coming off the still. So at that point,
But still, so is that a white whiskey as well?
yeah. So at that point, you're still white. You're just coming off the still, going into the cistern, and now you got to decide what to do with it, right? And so, what are your options? Well, you could just distill it down to some bottling proof and just sell it as a white dog, right? And I think you're not going to go below about 80 proof for an American whiskey as a bottling proof, right? But if you put it in wood, then you've got to deal with what's the barrel proof restrictions. And in the U.S., for any of the classifications of whiskey we've been talking about, you can't put it in at a proof higher than 125. And again, now that's just going into the barrel. It's going to sit in there. When it comes out of the barrel, you can proof it down to your bottling proof. So that's
with like distilled water or something. How do they do it?
Yeah, typically I think in a modern, it's still, I know we just used RO for sure. You don't want to take any chances. Reverse osmosis, you don't want any. A lot of people talk about their water, but honestly, that's a variable that a lot of people just want to eliminate because they really don't want to take any chances with the water being a little funny. So just completely clean it out
because minerals might add a lot of weirdness to the water.
Well, I think the reason that in Kentucky they were so keen on always talking about the limestone water was that the limestone pulled the iron out of the water. It's the story I remember, and the iron could cause some really funkiness when you're fermenting, and so that was something you wanted to try to get rid of. Of course, RO, will get rid of that for you. But those are kind of that mash bill, your distillation proof, what you're pulling it off at, we would say, and what you barrel at are kind of three of your really big toggles that you've got to play with when you're trying to make a whiskey. And then I guess a fourth one would be not just barrel proof, but what kind of barrel you're putting this into.
Yeah, so what kind of barrels do you typically use?
Well, again, for most of the designations that we're talking about, it's got to go in a new barrel. And this was some one use. This was like the Cooper's employment rule that someone came up with, and very successfully.
Seems like you can deforest a species pretty quick if you just use.
Well, what's interesting is a lot of the Scotches, they and if you go, I'll tell you, if anyone's in Louisville, a really great tour is to go over to Kelvin Cooperage. It's in North Louisville, and try to get them to let you walk through. Watching those guys build barrels is one of the coolest things. Of all the stuff I've done kind of around distilleries, man, the barrel side is just really just so interesting. And just really hard work, and those guys really, they're earning it for sure. But it made me think about it because Kelvin had set up it was a couple Scottish brothers that came to Louisville. They were Coopers. And this might go back 30 or 40 years when they first got going, but they were basically just buying used bourbon barrels from the big Kentucky bourbon houses. At that point, I think that the general way that they would transport them is they'd call them shakes, and they'd look them over. If they needed some repair, they could do spot repair, but they'd have to break the barrels down to like change out a stave or something, right? And the staves are kind of those vertical pieces of oak. They kind of is what the barrel's made out of. And then they'd break them down, they'd put them on a ship, and they'd send them over to Scotland, and someone on the other side would build them back up and sell them to the Scottish distilleries, because all that Scotch goes into use, almost all of it goes into use bourbon barrels. Some use sherry barrels, but so there's a lot of reasons that Scotch got that completely different flavor profile. But also, if you've noticed, Scotches usually don't have that bourbon red kind of color to them. If you hold even a very old Scotch up, it's it's more of a straw color, and that's because they don't typically use new oak, and of course in the U.S. that new oak is almost always charred, right? So it's going to impart a lot of color like immediately, and so the Kelvin guys, just to close that idea, soon found that there was a couple of things changed in the market. One, the shipping containers got so cheap and easy, they didn't even have to break those things down anymore. They just kind of come off one container from Jack Daniels, whoever they're buying from. They'll do a really quick cursory look, make sure, if any of them need any work. Otherwise, they'll just put them back in the container and send them off. It's a really nice business for them. But it got them to the point where they started making their own, and they're one of the ISC is by far the largest U.S. cooperage for spirits and wine barrels. But Kelvin's a nice competitor, and that's they got their start just repurposing for the Scots, and now they're building their own, and a lot of people are using their American oak.
So where does peat moss come about in that flavor profile from the Scotch?
Yeah. So again, remember that those Scotches are all malted barley, right? That's their mash bill. It's just 100% barley. But what does malted mean? Well, nothing's easy, right? So it's not like you're just grinding the corn like we do with a lot of bourbons, right? I mean, the grain doesn't need a huge amount of caressing, if you will, in American spirits. But the barley, going back to my idea that they've got these enzymes that are very useful for doing that conversion of starch to sugar. And again, that's just something, and nature added that to make the barley be able to feed itself when that fell into the ground, that seed, right? Because that's just a seed, and that's, that sprout's going to need, to do that conversion. Very efficient with barley, it ends up. And so to express those enzymes, you've got to do a heating of the barley, and that's the malting process. And it's, again, if you want to see this in action, Tex Malt up in Fort Worth, those guys, man, they're this crew of young dudes who for some reason decided they wanted to do floor malting on their own, and they're just killing it, man. They're just really killing it. They've expanded like 4 or 5 times since I've known them. And they're out there just like you can think with these big rakes, and they're just kind of raking this, so you're going to heat this stuff up and get it to a certain temperature. It's got to be a certain humidity level. And then you got to make sure, of course, no mold or anything weird happens to it while it's drying back out, right? So that's kind of this malting process. And historically in Scotland, the heat source you would use to do all that heating, to do all the work, would be peat, because that's kind of what they've got to work with. And, again, I mean, don't overthink where all these flavor profiles come from. It's, again, regionality. It's like, what do you got to work with? Well, I got
moss.
I've got barley, and I've got some peat that I use to heat my house and get my tea cooking in the morning, and I'm going to use it for this too. And that's why it's more prominent in some parts of Scotland and Scotches, right? Than it is in others where they might have had other sources of heat and fuel, I guess I should say. So that's kind of how that kind of came about. And some people, and I'll tell you, I'm a peat guy.
You like peat moss?
Lagavulin and 16 was definitely my jam when I was a Scotch guy.
I got one good story about peat moss. So I used to go into bars and just order like one thing that I had not had before, like just trying to make sure I kind of understand the flavors. And I would even order, I know it sounds weird, but like the mixers just by themselves, just so I can kind of tell what the drink should taste like, what it's going to taste like. But the first time I went and I had Scotch, this is actually kind of embarrassing, but I ordered, I'm not going to say which one it was, but I got this very nice Scotch off the wall, and the bartender is kind of like whatever, it was kind of like you're talking day drinking. There's nobody in there. And so he pours me a thing, and I take a sip, and I'm like, oh, there's something very wrong with this. It's terrible. And he's like, oh, is it, so he pours himself a little bit of it.
Mm-hmm.
He tries it. He's like, oh, yes. Oh, I'm so sorry, sir. The bottle must have gone bad.
Mm-hmm.
Pours the whole bottle out, throws it in the trash. Like, I'm really sorry. Gets another one off the wall, opens it up, pours me. And I'm like, I take a sip. I'm like, oh no, that is exactly what that's supposed to taste like.
Whoops.
That was probably a multi-$100 mistake. But anyway, that was my first introduction to peat moss. I would say that my personal flavor profile that I prefer is much more American whiskey, not rye, specifically bourbons. And, but I'm not I couldn't exactly tell you what it is about peat moss that kind of makes me go, I think I prefer this. What do you think? How would you describe that flavor?
It's definitely, it's not like one thing to think about with flavors is, you try when you're in the business, I guess, to come up with this common vocabulary so when you're doing tastings that everybody is, kind of thinks they're talking about the same thing, like, that's baby vomit, or whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. You get a certain, and peat's kind of a hard one, right? It's like, what is that for an American? What does that remind you of? It doesn't remind you of much and nothing probably good, right? But it's kind of, it's just, it's astringent, it's smoky, right? I think, again, when I think about Lagavulin, it's got that smokiness that comes from exactly kind of how I describe how they're using it, right? And for me, it's just it's very comforting for some reason. I don't know why.
I know myself, and I know I could get used to it if I drank enough of it. It reminds me a little bit of the flavor profile you get when you're kind of near a house that's like being tarred. You know what I mean? Like that thing that's on your palate. Yep. Not the smell, but the thing that's going on in your mouth a little bit. That's kind of the sensation I get. It's very similar to that, which
not a selling point.
No, it isn't, but it also isn't like really off-putting. It's more like I don't necessarily want to be too close to this house while this thing is happening.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like
the flavors that I find more off-putting are more, and again, you'll hear these same things over. Baby vomit is a very common one. It's from a butyl off flavor that you'll get sometimes, but anything that's more kind of barnyardy, like hay's okay, but when it gets a little more towards a little more funkier, and you'll pick those up sometimes, and especially when you're doing barrel by barrel tastings as opposed to which is kind of a big part of the whole conversation, right? Which is, what do you do when it comes out of the barrel? And typically you'd be looking for a common flavor profile. You need to understand the barrels you've got in your inventory and how you can bring those together in the right proportions to give you the flavor that your customers are familiar with. And I'll tell you, if you've got 8 million barrels in your warehouse, that's easier than if you've got 8. Mm-hmm.
I've had some very strange alcohols in my life because I go to all over the world, I'm sure, as you do, travel a lot just for the job. And I think the one, I would call this the second quote-unquote worst alcohol I've ever had was something called Gammeldansk, which is a Danish / I think Sweden also drinks it as well. It's kind of it kind of reminds me of the flavor you might expect if you went into like a rainforest and there was like, some very muddy area and you took all of this like random like debris and you squeezed it out and turned it into, and then and then added some tar because it's got a very similar kind of peat moss sort of vibe to it. And the first time I had it, I could not get this flavor out of my mouth. It was just terrible, like really, really just awful flavor. But then I bought a bottle of it. Actually, when I was at the airport, I bought every bottle they had, and I just gave them out as gifts to my friends just to be funny. But then I bought myself a bottle, and I drank it over time, and I realized actually I quite a bit like it. It's actually, but it took drinking enough of it for me to go, and that's what I feel about peat moss. I feel like I actually could like it quite a bit, but I would have to do that. I would have to spend time drinking.
Gotcha. So this, which I'm not familiar with, do you think it's the flavor is a natural component of the distillation, kind of like the peat coming across, or is it something they're adding?
No, I think it's something crazy like 21 herbs and spices or whatever, and it's that funkiness coming from some of those herbs.
So that goes back. That's a good kind of segue, I think, into this idea of medicinal, right? And so you've got kind of two things going on. One, you've got poor distillation that used to go on, and you needed ways to just kind of mask that, right? And maybe a milk punch would be an easy way to try to, get to soften up a rough liquor. But the other idea of these botanicals is they're not really added originally for the flavor, but they're added very much because they were considered medicinal, right? And so when you think about green chartreuse now, and the monks still make it by that same recipe with 130 or so. I mean, originally that was very much designed as this medicinal, and every herb supposedly had some specific property. A well-known spirits guy, Camper English, just wrote a nice book called Doctors and Distillers. If anyone's interested in going down that rabbit hole, there's really some interesting histories around almost every spirit where they're doing strange things. And for me, the one that always is the biggest turnoff for me is anything that's got that anise, and so even
like Jägermeister.
Yeah, anything,
So Gamadansk has anise in it.
Yeah, that's the one I just can't.
It's pretty abrasive.
Yeah. So that's the one I avoid. Otherwise, if it doesn't have a strong anise, I'm usually I'm willing to give it a go.
So there's also this concept of the angel share. Can you talk about that a little bit? Yeah,
and that's a good one for kind of thinking about how to make whiskey in Texas. So actually there's a lot of, we could go a couple of ways on angel share. I mentioned there's a maximum proof that you can put your spirit into the barrel, and so that's your barrel proof, and that's one of the main things you've got to mark for the feds, right? Because they want to be able to figure out exactly how much alcohol is in that barrel. But what happens is over time, the magic of the barrel is the heating and cooling cycles over the years. The liquid is actually moving in and out of the actual oak, right? So the white oak is just a phenomenal product for tight cooperage. I mean, if it wasn't for white oak, it'd be really hard to do a lot of things we try to do as distillers. But over time, depending on humidity and temperature, you can lose either alcohol through the wood. It'll actually just work its way all the way out into the environment. And if you're in a high humidity area, you're probably going to lose more alcohol. If you're in a very dry environment, maybe more water's going to just work its way out, just trying to equalize, right? And so that's what they call the angel share, right? It's what you lose just by evaporation, but you're in a sealed container. It's just evaporating literally through that, that inch thick piece of wood that you've got there, which is pretty amazing. And what tends to happen, and you try to soak your barrels a little bit before you fill them, but you're going to lose some just going in the dry wood, and that might not come back out, and then the evaporation. And so depending on the environment you're in, the angel share, especially the first year, can be a pretty large number. You can lose, if you've got, I'm trying to think of exact numbers, but I mean, if you lost, over the time you had something in a barrel, certainly 25% would not surprise anybody. So you got to really,
I've heard as high as 40 even.
Yeah, well, I'm
over not in the first year necessarily.
No, the first year is the worst, and but then after that, it's like, and again, this gets back into like talking about Texas, right? I'm thinking more like you're going to have it in wood for 4 years, right? If you're in Kentucky, yeah, sure, you might have something in wood for 8, 10, 12 years, right? And so your number is definitely going to be a lot higher. But again, I'm of the opinion that American whiskey tends to be over-oaked, you know. I mean, we could have a long conversation around the tax structure that was built up, and the only reason that the Kentucky distillers ever asked for an extension to the bonded period, which is how long you can keep something in wood before you have to pay the tax on it, was only ever driven by the fact that they were shitty businessmen, and when they overproduced, they knew they were going to lose everything if they couldn't figure out a way to extend the bonded period. And they had a lot of friends in Congress, and often they got the way that they wanted. But
that's a way the Angels share actually is useful, because you lose that 20% that first year, maybe 30-40% over 5 years or something. Great. Yeah. Well, we tax us on the remaining amount, not the original amount.
Yeah, and that was always a conversation those guys had too. What were they getting taxed on? Was it with the evaporation tax or not? You know. So yeah, again, everything. And I'm not saying that's bad. I mean, it's a hard business. It's a really hard business. But I think particularly those pre-Prohibition years, where it got so hyper competitive between what they called the straight distillers, which were the Kentucky, Tennessee guys, and the rectifiers and the wholesalers.
Yeah, talk about rectification. I think that's useful too.
Yeah, so I mean, what I think people don't really realize is how much of a commodity whiskey was, certainly pre-Civil War, and honestly for quite a bit longer. I mean, distillers didn't have brands. Most of them were just kind of, the industry had not industrialized before the Civil War at all. I mean, you know, that same still that you see Popcorn Sutton use, and, you know, just a pot and a thumper with a worm to condense. You know, that's how a lot of folks were just, you know, and if they had an excess corn crop, they'd make some corn whiskey, and then they'd just sell it to a rectifier. And what a rectifier was someone who would clean up whiskey that, you know, needed cleaning up, for lack of a better. And so, you know, I mean, Kentucky, even back then, made a lot of good whiskey for sure, but they made a lot of really bad whiskey too, right? And the rectifiers were the ones, and they had different tricks, and the primary one being the use of charcoal, right? So just very similarly to how you'd put whiskey into a charred barrel, and that would help you reduce, mask on, actually, and this was a bit of something that the industry didn't understand for, you know, over 100 years, was, are you really reducing those, what they call fusel oils, you know, which give a lot of off flavors and tastes and have some poisons in them, you know, literally. I mean, in small doses, believe me, but the kind of stuff that gives you a bad hangover. Were you really eliminating those when you put something away in wood for years, or were you just masking the flavor? It ends up they were kind of just masking the flavor. So when the pure food law came around and they started arguing about what whiskey should be and what, you know, the purity came up a lot. That was the word that came up around pure food law. It ended up the rectified whiskey was cleaner. It was pure in the sense that they were taking more of those fusel oils out of it. You know, vodka is really probably the cleanest of these products. And so the rectifiers, instead of using thyme and charred barrels, they would just use vats of charcoal. And it works very well. I mean, you can take some pretty funkified whiskey and pour it through, you know, 3 feet of charcoal. And this is kind of like what Jack Daniels did before. They would use charcoal. I'm not sure how they were able to do this, because there was a real church and state, real, you know, wall between rectifiers and distillers back then, because they wanted to tax them differently and for other reasons. But the reason it got so competitive was we got into, you know, by the 1880s, and the idea of brands were really kind of becoming more of a thing for consumer goods, right? And you had some, you know, you've got some examples like Heinz and, you know, ketchups and beans and things, and branded beers for sure. And the whiskey guys suddenly think,
like Busch, I think was a big one.
Yeah, Anheuser-Busch, sure, and that was true in Texas too. Anheuser himself had a distillery or a brewery in Houston, but the distillers late to the game decided they needed to be closer to their customers, right? It's this like, oh, we're too far removed from our end user. We're leaving too much money on the table. It's just this kind of like really standard business problem where, now you're just a supplier, but they're the manufacturer, so it really annoys them, right? So they're trying to figure out how they got in this position where the rectifiers and the wholesalers are the ones making all the money because they actually own the brand, even though they're using this other product, right? And that caused this. That war went on for decades up until the Pure Food and Drug Act, where it really finally kind of came to a head.
You mentioned a little bit about the Taft thing. That'd probably be worth talking about that.
Yeah. I love this story. It's got a good kind of Texas angle, too. If I lose my way, just bring me back. All right, Taft is where I'm trying to go. And then John Simpson is the guy on the Texas side. They had been trying to pass a national pure food law for decades, right? And now we're firmly in the progressive era, early 1900s, and we've got Teddy Roosevelt in the White House, and he decides he's going to get it done, which is great. He got a lot of credit for it. He certainly wanted credit for it because it literally had been such a decades-long kind of goal for progressives. But the odd thing is maybe for folks that the passage of the law and the implementation of the law was a very, very long road in the sense that they didn't have the regulatory regime in place to enforce it or even interpret it. Right, they didn't have a full Food and Drug Administration, and all the the states didn't have their corresponding bits. So Teddy Roosevelt, and he took it on himself and his Attorney General. I mean, they were like hands on this for years, trying to figure out how to interpret this law. And for some reason, and I attribute it to this giant war going on and all the money being thrown at all these politicians from the rectifier side and from the straight distiller side, trying to get Roosevelt to interpret that law to their best advantage and to try to crush their competitors, right? Well, how might you do that? Well, you might really put a very tight definition on what whiskey has to be, right? And so real whiskey might have to be 4 years old, always in oak. You can think of things that would make it very difficult for a rectifier, who by this time, I guess I should caveat off, is now off making their own. After the 1890s, they legalized column stills. The rectifiers don't need to use those old high wines from just your mom and pop distillers. They're making their own, and they're just off on their own, which makes them even more competitively threatening to these straight distillers. And so that's pretty much what happens. Roosevelt completely goes, if the Kentucky guys were going to come up with their definition of what real whiskey is and what imitation whiskey is, then Roosevelt gives them what they want, right? And it puts the rectifiers in a really bad place because no one wants to write imitation whiskey on their label, right? And that's pretty much what they would have to do. Well, Roosevelt doesn't have another term. He handpicks Taft to come in and be a successor, but Taft's from Ohio, and all the big rectifiers are in Ohio. And so Taft reopens this. It's considered the story's over. They've already spent like 2 years, it's a stupid amount of time that they've been spending trying to figure this out. Taft completely upends it, pretty much says Roosevelt didn't know what he was doing, rewrites the law after, again, another like 18 months worth of work. I mean, again, it's just insane how much time they're spending, at the national level just on trying to figure out whiskey. And Taft comes up with these very sympathetic definitions for rectifiers, basically making it's still got to be grain for the most part, but almost anything now can be called whiskey. Infuriates all the Kentucky guys. Well, In the meantime, Texas has passed its own pure food and drug law. It was called the Bland Act. Not that anyone remembers it now. But one of the neat things or important things it did was it allowed Texas to hire a dairy and food commissioner, which is going to be just a bureaucrat that can at least, interpret the Texas law, try to, marry it to the national law, make sure, things are getting enforced properly. And so this dude's name is John Simpson. And John Simpson's he'd been a high school chemistry teacher until they found this guy up in Dallas, and they're like, hey, man, you want this job? And he's like, yeah, sure. And he's in his 20s, And I don't know that he knows anything about whiskey, honestly. But when he hears the Taft, he comes in. They're still, using basically assuming the Roosevelt definitions are going to be continued. Well, then Taft, upends this. And for some reason, this guy, John Simpson, just decides, no way, no, that's not good enough. That whiskey, literally what he says is that whiskey is not good enough for Texans, right? And we're not going to allow Taft whiskey in.
Wow.
Anything that meets the Taft definition is going to be basically confiscated in Texas. And so then, what's he do, right? He goes smartly to the pharmacopoeia definition, and he just says, in Texas we're going to require basically a medicinal a level of quality in our whiskey. And if you look at the thing now, it's better than, it's got to be 4 years old. It can't have, no additives, no colorings. It's a really sweet, I half joked that I want to make his birthday a state holiday, because the guy, he deserves some respect. So, that's kind of and that's, believe it or not, kind of the short version of the Taft thing. I really do think it was because he had so many friends in Ohio that he really needed to do something to alleviate the pain that the Roosevelt administration put on those guys. And then unfortunately, Prohibition came not that much longer, another decade. We're in less than that actually into Prohibition, considering how long it took to all wash out. So then, things change after when Prohibition is over. But for a decade there, Texas had its own standard, and it was probably the best in the country, I'm imagining.
And so is that standard now been widely adopted, or is it?
Well, now post-Prohibition, we come back and they just decide, well, we're going to have all these. Now we're going to create all these standards of identity, kind of the stuff we talked about earlier. And there's different designations. Like now, you can have what's called a spirit whiskey, which can have a lot of neutral grain in it, which would be basically just like mixing a little whiskey with vodka, right? That's basically what you're doing. So you do kind of have to call it something different. Back in the Roosevelt kind of definitions, that would have been more of an imitation whiskey. So calling it spirit whiskey kind of sounds like, it doesn't sound too bad. But, that's not really, that's not what we would call a pure whiskey. That's kind of like in Scotland, it'd be the difference between the single malts and the blends. And the blend, people turn their nose up to the blends, even though some of them are actually quite nice. Yeah. But just a kind of different level of designation.
So let's talk about the war. I think that was, it was a good chunk of your book. You dedicated quite a bit of time to it. I think it was actually very interesting. I think first is talking more about the medicinal side of it. So the distilleries were actually very useful in the war effort as a combat-related producer of chemicals, effectively. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was particularly true in the Confederacy, right? Because the Union blockade restricted the Confederacy from going to Europe and getting some of those pharmaceuticals they would have got before the war, things like morphine and anti-malarials and, just a host of things that they were already making. So, yeah, absolutely. So, again, at the time, whiskey was considered a medicinal, so there was hospital use, there was field use, right, for, pain and suffering kind of, hardship kind of, everybody gets a gill, as was very common in the Navy as well as the Army.
And what is that?
A gill was 4 ounces, so it was kind of like a double. Give me a double. That was their allocation every morning. Give me a double, a gill. Yeah.
Start with a double.
Yeah. Well, early and often. I mean, that was definitely the way.
What were the average rations per day for the military?
Yeah, I think 4 ounces was what they gave.
Oh, all day.
Yeah, no, I think, so for the Confederacy in the Civil War, they stopped that as a standard. The Confederate Navy kept it on because they were having trouble recruiting. The Union Navy stopped it, but that's a little. It's a little complicated because there's always a difference between officers and enlisted men. And the British Navy, of course, kept it up until like the World War II or something. It was a big deal when they finally got rid of it. But there is a funny story before we get to the botanicals around that Corpus Christi naval fight. The Union was in the Gulf and they were bombarding Corpus. And as I say, the Union enlisted, the sailors didn't have a whiskey ration at that point. The officers could have whiskey. And on this particular gunship, it seems some of the sailors had gotten into the officers' whiskey barrel and thinking they needed a place to store it. They had these old exploding balls, which they would fill with gunpowder, and somehow they'd shoot them, and then they'd kind of secondary blow up when they hit their target. And the Confederates, after the battle, noticed there were a bunch of duds, right? Unusual little numbers, so they're trying to figure out what's going on. And so when they open these things up, probably hoping they could just grab the powder, they find they're full of whiskey. And so it seems that the sailors decided, you know what, let's store them in here because we don't keep them, the powder probably goes in just at the last, minute because for a lot of reasons, and assume that they'd drink it before they saw battle. And unfortunately, once the battle came, they had no choice but to fill the barrels and shoot them into Corpus, even though they were full of whiskey. So that's kind of a funny Texas story. But going back to the blockade and the botanicals, in addition to those, let's call them hospital and field uses, there was also a real need to figure out how to create pharmaceuticals from local botanicals. And so the Confederate Army, or military, I guess I should say, recognized this immediately. Once the blockade kind of went up, they knew they better figure out kind of what they had access to, what they might be able to grow more formally for different medications.
It's like an opium and hard alcohol for use in all kinds of different things. Like you mentioned antimalarials.
Yeah, antimalarial is kind of an obvious one. I think it's easy for people to grasp. I mean, basically, they were taking several different native tree barks and macerating those barks in medicinal alcohol, which was whiskey, right? And so so
dogwood.
Yeah, I think
was it willow.
Yeah, and ash. I think there were several of them, and it was a legitimate kind of as good as we can do considering we're in this. But they needed a lot of alcohol to do that, and I think the last year of the war, the Confederate military was using 50 or 60,000 gallons of alcohol a month. I mean, it was a pretty substantial amount, and by all accounts, very legitimate, right? So from the military side, there was just no argument that this was a war. This was a war necessity, but you got to look at it from the civilian side too, right? And this was, Texas again is a really good example. You've got Governor Lubbock. One, he's kind of a teetotaler, so he's already kind of got a hair. We shouldn't let folks. We don't want drunkards in the Army anyway. But his other more, I think, legitimate concern was that the amount of distilling that was going on, and given the already depressed levels of farming going on, because so many people were off fighting in the war, that there were shortages of grain anyway. And if so much of that grain was being diverted to making whiskey, folks were potentially going hungry. And in some cases, you know,
they were literally starving.
They literally or just couldn't afford the elevated prices. You've got decreased demand, decreased supply and increased demand because of all the extra distillation going on, and so folks are boxed out. You know, they literally can't afford to make cornbread, and so Lubbock tries to, by executive order, say, you know, I'm confiscating all the stills I can find, and I'm having the military enforce that no additional stills will be built. Well, the military says, from their side, they're like, you know, that's a no-go. If you're not going to let us contract for this, we're just going to build our own distilleries in state, which they did. They had one of the medical labs, Confederate medical labs, was in Tyler, and they had a nice distillery right outside of Tyler. But what happened was, going back to the civilian side, Lubbock tried to outlaw by proclamation. He got challenged in court by a distiller in Russ County who also happened to be the sheriff up there. So he convinced a judge to help him challenge it. Lubbock decided it would be better if it became a law, and he tried to get the Congress to introduce it to create a new law. And now we get back to the tax side again. Mm-hmm. The Confederacy's in dire need of cash more even than the Union, right? So instead of outlawing it, they decide, you know what, we're going to make $1,000 per still annual tax for every distiller in the state and try to get some revenue.
What is that in today's money, approximately?
You know, I don't
about close to 100,000.
It's a lot of money.
Between 110 and 100,000, somewhere in that range.
I mean, think about how much money that is. Yeah. And let me tell you, that was for, you could tell, but that was annual, and that was for an 80-gallon pot still. That's not a big. If you had a bigger still than that, it was going to be more than that. I mean, that's a pretty modest size still. You're going to have to be punching out a lot. You're going to have to be, you know, making a lot of whiskey for that to pay off. But
hide a few in the woods.
Well, that's a whole other interesting conversation about how much of that went on. But there, by my count, I don't think there were more distillers operating in Texas until probably just a couple of years ago, literally, like with all the craft going on in the state now. And there's over 100 craft guys in the state now since the Civil War, right? That was the high water mark for the entire history of Texas until very recently. They just couldn't make enough booze and they were just, all these guys were making a fortune. They really were all just making a fortune, you know?
So at one point earlier in the conversation, you mentioned everything was like a commodity, but not like it is like a commodity. It actually was a commodity, and it went from something crazy like 15 cents to $2 a gallon.
Yeah, plus, particularly in the North, because that was literally the tax became. So you had a commodity that was trading at about 15 cents that they started taxing $2 on top of that, right? And then you get all the inflation during the war, and so you're well above that mark.
That's a huge amount of inflation.
It's a huge amount, but it really worked out well for the Union. They really made a big chunk of the money that financed the war through that whiskey tax. It was a smart move, and they couldn't give it up. I mean, they couldn't quit it after the war, right? Which is where everything changes post-Civil War, because that tax. I mean, the taxes come down. Don't get me wrong, but they never go away. And they are needed up until Prohibition. A big part of Prohibition, that whole run-up, is trying to figure out, well, how do we counter the argument about how much federal revenue is tied to the whiskey tax, right? We need to figure out another way So they try an income tax, but then that gets slapped down, So it's this whole long, there's reasons it took so long for them to finally come around. There's a lot of politics behind it. And that tax was a big part. And to enforce that tax, you needed just this draconian enforcement mechanism where literally, the feds would, have special locks in the bonded warehouses. They'd, if you were over a certain size, they'd have an overseer that would live out there or at least be out there. The distiller couldn't get into their own, rick house unless the federal agent was there to keep an eye on them. I mean, it was really a very regimented industry just, by, let's say, 1868, 1870, from then on, I mean, really early, and again, as I say in the book, I mean, compared to any other industry, nothing else was regulated like this, even by a long shot.
Not even like cigarettes or anything.
No, nothing, or pharmaceuticals. I mean, you had that whole patent medicine that went on. Yeah. I mean, even the Food and Drug Act of 1906 didn't really hem in the patent medicine guys as much as you would think. I mean, it's weird. It's definitely weird. But so the Civil War is a really pivotal shift, and you get to where now the burden, the regulatory burden, gets so high post-war, and then of course South back in the Union by the mid-70s, and all those guys that had been kind of either that old frontier distiller kind of guys that they're tied to they've got steam from a sawmill, or they've got an old grist mill, or those were the early kind of frontier guys. It's just too complicated, right? I mean, they don't want to deal with that. So you've got very few guys who want to put up with that kind of headache going into kind of this modern era, into that last quarter century of the 1800s.
So you had one line in here that I thought, it was kind of a throwaway line, but I thought it was very interesting, that the lowest quality of whiskey was used in trade with the Native Americans.
Yeah,
that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and I mean,
I guess that shouldn't surprise me, but
yeah, and I don't know what else to say on that. It's obviously not a great look for those whiskey wholesalers.
What was that? I mean, was it just high proof cut and just call it a day? Like not aged? Like what kind of whiskey was that?
Going back to the rectifiers. I think rectifiers in general are kind of maligned more generally, again, than they need to be. I mean, there's all these stories about the way they would, so I kind of describe them as, they're just running, kind of mediocre whiskey through mediocre new make through charcoal and cleaning it up. But there were a lot of tricks, that you could add, things to make it feel like it had more punch. So you could water it down, but then add, something in there, to give it a little more kick. Yeah, certainly there were ways to color it with, tobacco or caramel, or some were nastier things than others. And so the lower grades of whiskey could be pretty rough. And the rectifiers were certainly not all saints, right? And I think the general consensus is that the whiskey that went up and was traded, and so these would again be guys up around Denison who, you're kind of close to the Red River, and you're just kind of sneaking stuff in to the what was in the Indian Territory, are not sending their best product up there for the native consumption. And I mean, pre statehood for Oklahoma, those tribes were very concerned about alcohol use and had prohibition. So when that vote happened, you had kind of the Anglo half in the west and the traditional tribes in the east, and it was everybody was in agreement that prohibition was important, and so Oklahoma was I think at the time it might have been the only state that had a prohibition built into the original state constitution.
Well, so speaking of prohibition, it seems like there was a pretty large spike in the the proofing during that phase. It seems like it was just cheaper to produce extremely like high proofed whiskey and vodkas or whatever across state lines or whatever they were trying to move it around, for the purpose of making people drunk. But then you had this thing that was just awful, right? It was just terrible, like not consumable. So that's where a lot of the spirits that we currently think of in mixed drinks are start coming at on the scene. We start seeing a lot more like Manhattans and Old Fashions and whatever, and that's largely to cover up how bad this product is.
Yeah, I think that's partially true. I agree with that. I mean, I think the whole idea of cocktails in Texas is kind of an interesting conversation in itself too. I mean, we talked about kind of, that frontier mentality was much more kind of a shot and a warm beer was probably fine for most of Texas. And so cocktails didn't play quite as much. And, so these guys weren't even, it was kind of a macho thing to just like, so the quality of that whiskey maybe didn't matter that much. The proof probably did more than anything. But going back even to the 1840s, there were really vibrant cocktail cultures in Galveston and in Houston. And the funny thing, when people, the first thing they think of, they didn't have any ice. So what are you talking about cocktails? But they did, because this guy, Frederick Tudor up in Boston, had been shipping ice around the world since like the 1820s. I mean, this dude, this is one of the crazier. And if anybody wants to get a quick kind of like, just like Google the frozen ice trade. And it's like, what? Were they really? I mean, they were shipping ice year round from Boston to India. It's just a crazy business model, but it worked really well. This guy made a fortune. And he was shipping, obviously, ice down through the South. I mean, he kind of started Charleston, Savannah, and worked his way around, New Orleans, and then was selling plenty of ice for 40 or 50 years, and, Galveston, and that could get transported up through the state. I mean, it's really an amazing kind of idea that it worked. And they never taxed the ice as a luxury. It was one of the few things that, even though it obviously was a luxury, that was one thing like they decided, no, down here it's a necessity. We're not. And so, again, Galveston and Houston had these really, I mean, you can go back and see guys kind of coming through and kind of talking about all these crazy drinks that they could get in these towns. Again, going back as early as like the 1840s. But the interesting thing to me is that Texas never had that pre-prohibition famous cocktail that someone down there in Galveston made and became, kind of a national drink. And I don't know why that is. I'm sure they had a lot of great bartenders, but they seem kind of just fine, making what people were used to that had come over from the States. So when you look into that and you're thinking, well, are there any cocktails that we can confidently say were created in Texas? And the funny thing is, yeah, but it's not till 1970 when the frozen margarita is invented in Dallas. And I think it was 71. And you think, well, okay, what happened? And why did that happen? Well, even though Prohibition ended in the early 30s, Texas didn't go back and really reform its restrictions on saloons. There was still, I mean, that carryover, that hangover from Prohibition lasted from the 30s to the 70s. It wasn't until the 1970 where they went back and changed the law so you could actually buy a mixed drink in a Texas bar. And so a year later, now people are celebrating. They're like, we need a new drink. And they come up with the frozen margarita, which I think is a very fine, if Texas needs to hang his hat on any mixed drink, I'm cool with it being a frozen margarita. I mean, it's like my wife's favorite go-to for sure. But it's another kind of like interesting thing, really think about how long that kind of influence was, even in Texas, right? You think it's got such a rowdy reputation. But again, there's always been this really core set of prohibition sentiment in the state that's for a long time in its history really has really held sway.
Okay, I gotta ask: are you an ice or no ice?
I'm neat. Yeah, no ice for me. Yeah.
So the reason I've heard that I think is probably the reason that I started drinking everything neat effectively is. If you cool it down, you cannot taste the alcohol as much, which is one of the reasons why a lot of people prefer to have their drinks cold. Is you cannot taste the alcohol as much. And so if you actually enjoy alcohol, if you actually enjoy the flavor and want to know what the real flavor profile is, you want to drink it at room temperature, or maybe even warm, which is kind of even stranger, I think, for most people. Yeah. So I've just always been a no ice whiskey drinker.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I guess I would recommend to folks that think they need a little ice, and there's nothing wrong with ice. I mean, I really one thing I always tell people is just drink the way you want.
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
But if it's just that initial burn that's really the problem, just let that thing sit a couple minutes. Just pour it neat, but just give it a minute before you and a lot of that will burn off initially and really soften it up just a little bit. The Scotch buddies I used to drink with that I mentioned on the front end of this chat, they used to joke, if you can't afford Macallan 18, just buy 12 and let it sit 15 minutes before you start drinking. And they weren't all wrong.
Uh-huh.
You can soften it up a bit if you just let a little of that alcohol burn off. So
yeah, the other reason I've heard is that every sip is going to be different when you put when you put ice in it.
That's my problem. Yeah, and that
you don't get consistency between sips.
Yeah,
like the first sip is not watered down, the last one's super watered down.
Yeah, and my trouble is it's really hard. You might find like the spot you really want it, but there's no way to stop the melting at that point, right? So yeah, okay, yeah, exactly. No, I agree.
Unless you want to fish it out with your hands, right? Or something.
Exactly.
No one's gonna do that. All right, I think it's time to start talking about moonshine.
Okay.
Moonshine version of whiskey. So. What? First of all, what is the culture that created that kind of subsect of the distilling industry, and then what was sort of the ramifications of it?
Yeah. So let me make the distinction we talked about a little bit before between new make and moonshine, right? They're basically the same thing in that they're unaged spirits. But moonshine has the added component that it's usually untaxed, right? So it's not a legal product as a new make could be. So you could have a registered distillery that's just looking to make some cash, and they'll introduce a white whiskey or a new make. It will have to, the other distinction is going to be, if that's the case, then it's got to meet those some standards. Like if it's going to be labeled a whiskey again, it's got to be a grain product. Whereas moonshines could be, you've got these sugar shines that could be made just with cane sugar, right? They're made, the whole popcorn Sutton kind of deal, right? Completely different animal, never intends to see wood, right? It's going to be kind of just collected in a cistern and then usually just put in gallon jugs and sold that way, right? And that's the whole, that's the business model. The history of moonshining in the United States, I think it's very associated with the Deep South, and I think rightly so. And remember when the new tax regime's coming in just post-Civil War, right? And now all the ex-Confederate states are coming back into the Union, and the IRS now goes to all these distillers, and they say not only, hey, by the way, we've got a new whiskey tax, and so you guys are going to be taxed for everything you make going forward. They also say, by the way, we need to figure out how much you made during the rebellion because you're getting taxed for everything you made during the war. So they weren't trying.
I'm sure that went over well.
Yeah, they weren't trying to make friends. But, I don't want to get into the whole Reconstruction and all that crazy. Not a pretty history in my view. But the Union clearly lost the South again for another 100 years in a lot of ways, after the 1870s and Reconstruction failed. One thing they were not going to do was lose that tax base, right? So there were a lot of things they were willing to give up as far as control in the South. But the Treasury Department was adamant that they were going to get that tax revenue. And so the enforcement in the Mountain South particularly was really, really aggressive, right? And so the amount of carnage that went on in those revenue wars, right post Reconstruction, so late 1870s. There were, I forget now the total number of revenue agents that died in those, but I think it was up in the hundreds. It was a war. It was really a war. And if a federal agent killed a moonshiner, local state authorities would often grab them and try to try him in state courts for murder. Not recognizing their duty as federal officers trying to enforce federal tax law. There was a bit of a lull in the 1880s. I think they were trying to find that sweet spot where they could, get that revenue. There's always like some point where people just say, forget it, I'm going back in the woods, right? And that was hard for them to find. In the 1890s, they had another kind of flare up where again, just a lot of gunplay, a lot of dead bodies. And most of that again in the South, and I think it was as much political as it was kind of an economic kind of decision, right? Both are playing in there, but I think it was a much political statement on both sides and kind of real kind of power dynamics of kind of national versus state rights. And which you don't see as much in other parts of the country throughout that period, certainly not with that level of violence. There was a good bit of moonshining going on in Texas as well, but not that level of violence. I think there's a couple examples of moonshiners being shot, but the example I found of a federal agent being killed it was weird in a couple ways. It was in the 1880s, which again was a bit of a quiet period. And it was one of these federal warehouse guys who was working at a registered distillery. And this guy, John Laws, was a distiller. And this guy, Garrison, who I remember because of Dan Garrison, our first distiller here in Texas recently, Laws decided Garrison was sneaking in, because remember now, he's the federal agent, so he's the one that's got the key. Mm-hmm. But the guy also seems to be a bit of a booze hound who's sneaking into Laws' warehouse and taking a few jugs every other night. And so Laws waits in kind of his barn. He hides his horse. He waits in his barn. Sure enough, Garrison shows up. He waits till he goes in and comes out with a couple jugs, and he shoots him dead right there. He's got a Confederate with him just to be his witness because he's sure no one's going to convict him, right? He goes to trial. He actually does get convicted. But then he finds a smart lawyer who says the judge misinterpreted the the ruling on what a legal defense is against robbery at night, and there's this very Texas kind of distinction. And so to be able to kill somebody, you've got laxer laws, let us say, if this happens during the night.
In your property at night.
Yeah, well, but get this. So the other thing about property, it's not that you can shoot the guy only on your property. It's shooting distance from your property. So if he's heading over the ridge, but as long as you're still shooting from your land, you can still plink that guy, right? Which is a Texas, again, a nice Texas little extension. And then the definition of night is 30 minutes before, after sunrise and 30 minutes before sunset or something. Anyway, the guy gets off, and he doesn't seem to have any remorse about it at all, honestly. And so that was actually the only good's probably not the right word, but example of there being a death of a federal agent in Texas. I'm sure there's probably others out there, but that one to me was kind of weird and interesting.
Yeah, sure. I also heard that the Prohibition kind of led to what we kind of now think of as automotive racing. It led to vehicles being souped up and as fast as possible, and durable suspension, and just be able to go like a bat out of hell in the middle of the night and try to evade police officers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think NASCAR will confirm, at least that they support that story. I don't know, maybe. But I think a lot of those early NASCAR drivers certainly had a background. And, if you're going to put that kind of money into your vehicle, you probably needed a good reason to go fast. And I think the bootleggers certainly were obvious candidates. I mean, a little, to me, a little darker side of that story is when you start looking post-Prohibition, and they set up this 3-tier network, which, is basically that you've got retailers, you've got distributors or wholesalers, and you've got producers. Never the twain meets. They make sure that if you own a liquor store, you certainly can't own a distillery too. Mm-hmm. And it kind of goes back to the Tide houses, TIED, Tide. Houses that where the breweries pre-Prohibition owned a lot of retail bars, and there was a lot of reasons that was just not a good idea. So post-Prohibition, they try to really separate these different tiers. And this is, I don't know if I really want to get this down on tape, but I guess I'll go ahead since I started.
Sure.
Which is, distillers hate distributors. I mean, they're just dead wood, but the story always that you hear about the early distributors is, well, who was good at distributing booze? Well, it was there was a lot of bootleggers out there that weren't even necessarily producers, although they could have been both. But post-Prohibition, a lot of those guys were kind of naturally the people who knew how to move these products around. So you've got a class of a business that has, no one's really kind of keen on their origin stories, and then certainly their business model is just really it needs to be updated as far as almost any distiller you talk to would tell you, boy, I'm not sure for the 30 points they're getting or whatever. That it's worth that kind of cost.
There's also some. I would have to assume this is a blue law, but effectively you can only import certain alcohols, despite the fact that it might be exactly up to par in every other way. There's a caveat, a list of things that can be imported. Do you have any context for that one?
Yeah, no, I don't think I do have any context for that one.
Because there's definitely some alcohols that are just like you cannot get in Texas. And
I should actually. I know that's related. Again, that might be related to the reach of the distributor that you're working with, right? So if because these relationships tend to be exclusive, although you can get carve outs. So if I'm a Texas distributor or manufacturer and I'm trying to I want to sell in, California. but my distributor doesn't distribute in California, then that could, keep me out of California unless I can talk them into giving me that carve out where I go find another distributor who's exclusively maybe in California, right? So it gets a little complicated, but I think a lot of that is just kind of how you're kind of tied to particular distributors, and so a lot of them are either just in one state or just regional guys. There's only, Republic and Southern Glacier are kind of the two big national distributors that are in the U.S. And if you want to go national and be available everywhere, you tend to kind of got to get in bed with one of those two players. And that's, neither of them are necessarily a great option for you, to be honest.
So I was going to ask a follow-up question. So the other blue law that I'm aware of in Texas is being able to buy in the morning on Sundays. Do you have any context for that one?
Well, it was part of that prohibition kind of pass what
some amount of temperance.
Yeah, if you can't pass a statewide complete prohibition, maybe you can try to do some. Maybe you can do something local or limited that you can actually get folks that will vote for. And the Sunday blue laws were something that almost everybody could get behind, at least back in the day, right? So you see those really everywhere. In Texas, they passed one. I never forget, in Houston, it passed maybe in the 40s. I forget now. But there's a famous Texas brewer who got charged with that, and it took like a 10 or 12 years to work its way through the system. It just, so they were on the books, but I'm not sure they were always enforced or could be enforced well. But that's one example I remember from Houston where this guy, Gable, of course, during the Civil War, he was one of those guys who switched to being a whiskey guy because there was so much money to be made, and then he went back to being a brewer after the war. But, I think they were easy that you could get a majority of people to vote for. It's the short answer for why you see that as a particular blue law.
So in your book, you also, in the title, Fires, Floods, Explosions, there was quite a few like big catastrophes that happened. And I forget the number now, but it was something crazy, like 20 million gallons that went, in the water or in the land or whatever that just did not make it to market because of catastrophe. So why is it so dangerous? What is the problem? Why is it so hard to do this?
Yeah, it's a tough business for a lot of reasons, and that going back to kind of like thinking about doing the book. One of it was thinking about why it's hard to do now, right? But the reasons are really different. Fire is always a concern because you're dealing with a very flammable liquid. It's just a fire now is as worrisome as it was probably then. But now, you worry more about competition and regulatory problems. Like, when we got Still Austin off the ground, it took, from like 2013 to 2017 until we opened. So, almost 4 years, 36 months of that, we're trying to get through Austin Fire Department.
Really?
Yeah, no, I kid you not, 36 full months.
And is that mostly the heaters or the evaporation of the... It is figuring out
everything about what would happen if the place caught on fire or there was a spill. Like the fire thing seems obvious, right? But the spill thing is not necessarily so obvious because you could have, let's say you had a big tank full of, 160 proof, and somehow it started spilling all over the floor, or maybe going down the drain would be a disaster for them, somehow ignited, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you block it from going anywhere, particularly down the drain? So there's all this curbing that has to go into it. It gets really more complicated. It's this containment kind of idea around what can be a very dangerous liquid. There's just, I mean, it's not really that exciting a topic. It's just a brutal grind to get through, you know. But I wanted to bring that up because, you know, fire is something that is just constantly a problem. And so when we go back to the book title and thinking again, just pre-prohibition, there's always going to be something burning down, right? And that happened, you know, there's a lot of examples of places burning. Floods are a problem. The floods aren't as much of a problem now. The reason they were so much of a problem then was because it goes back to my kind of comments around frontier distillers, right? Often they would be associated with a grist mill, right? So the biggest, you know, physical labor going on in this whole process is grinding all that corn and the wheat, right? So having a grist mill, if you can be adjacent to that, that's going to be a huge advantage.
And that's near water?
Correct. Before pre-steam, right, then your best source of water or best source of power is going to be to put this thing next to a water source. And so, you know, what I think is probably the earliest whiskey distiller in Texas, Jabez Fitzgerald, was up on the Red River, for example. And so he was probably producing whiskey in the late 1830s, I would think. And, you know, he was one of the early guys who just got washed away in a flood up there. Again, it makes sense when you think where they had to locate next to these sources of power. But then you've got the first guy who I think is probably the first guy who converts to steam. He's in Bastrop, just not too far from where we're talking. And he's got a general store, and he starts distilling with a little pot still in the general store. His name's Archibald Fitzgerald. And he decides, well, he hires a distiller, but the distiller burns out the bottom of his pot still, because it's direct fire. You know, you're just putting a fire under it. Just, again, popcorn Sutton. I mean, it's just like, you know, it's not very sophisticated. And he thinks, well, steam would make more sense. And they just opened this Bastrop sawmill that's steam powered. I'm going to buy into that and move my distillery over there, which he does. When he gets trying to figure out how to make it work, though, he scalds one of his employees to death with steam, right? And so, and that's exactly, he's just like, oh, man. And by, you know, the account that's still on the record, it just kind of, you know, really sours him to the idea of being a steam distiller, you know. So almost anything could go wrong. The other problem with steam back then, and this is where the explosions come in, is that steam boilers at that point did not have the safety features that they have today. And you certainly can still blow up a boiler. I mean, it happens. And when it happens, it's always catastrophic. But back then, it was a much more common, I mean, the safety, you know, release valves weren't a common feature. It was very much you had to work those things by art with a full-time engineer. And so there's examples of Reeves and Files south of Fort Worth being the most dramatic example of steam boilers blowing up and just completely destroying, you know, a distillery. Just you know, it's just like setting off a bomb inside your distillery. And then, of course, the bloodshed, we've talked a little bit about that, but that's, you know, there was always a little gunplay involved.
Yeah, but so the thing about the explosion, though, it's also the alcohol itself is very flammable.
Absolutely.
So it's like an explosion, then a secondary
accelerator.
Fire. Yeah, it kind of takes everything out.
Bad news. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's not one of those fires you can put out easily. And also alcohol burns in a way that it's kind of hard to see it as well. So you might think you have extinguished it and you had just go forever.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's it's just the lack of safety controls makes it.
Especially that super high proof. It could be burning, and you could look right at it, and you wouldn't know.
It could be clear, yeah. So it can be a dangerous business. Huh. Yeah, absolutely.
So at one point in your book, you had a counterfactual that I thought was really interesting, which was, what if barbed wire had been introduced earlier, and what effect do you think that would have had on the whiskey industry in Texas? And I thought that was interesting counterfactual. Can you go into that?
Yeah, I'm glad you appreciated that one. Where would that come from? Well, it goes back to one of the major problems with distillation in Texas, which was a lack of refrigeration, right? And so back then, distilling was always a seasonal activity. I mean, that's for sure. I mean, there's kind of a spring release and a fall release, and that's how everybody operated. But spring and fall could be pretty long, a fair amount of months if you're in Louisville compared to trying to do this in Waco, right? I mean, and so what we needed was to figure out how to better refrigerate our fermentations. That's the big kind of thing. Your yeast can't get too hot or it's just going to die, basically. So, we would set our tanks, I think, at Still Austin at around 90 degrees. You don't want it to you start getting off flavors, and if it gets too hot, it's just going to kill it off. Then you've got not enough alcohol in your beer because the yeast died, and you're not getting your yields. You're not making any money. So how does that relate to barbed wire? Well, and this is really an interesting part of the Texas story. If we go back to the Civil War and the blockade, they were working on early ice-making machines in France before the war. The Confederacy wanted to get their hands on a couple of them to use in hospitals particularly, and they did, one of which came through and made its way to San Antonio. And during the war, they worked very hard to try to make that thing operational. Well, it didn't help the war effort much, but it did create several really smart engineers, or trained a handful of really smart engineers that stayed in Texas and tried to improve on that Lacar version of an ice machine. And they did a lot of work through the 70s and 80s, particularly around the idea of moving beef in refrigerated. So the beef industry was going to be, they saw as a primary customer for these early ice making operations, right? Breweries would end up later being the drivers in Texas, but that was too late for the distillers. But so the problem with the beef guys was, they made a ton of money in those cattle drives because they could just feed the cattle would just eat grass along the way. And as the story went, if they had a clear shot to New York, they would have taken it, man. Those cattle drives wouldn't have stopped in Kansas at the railhead. They would have just kept going because then they wouldn't even have to pay the rail fees, right? I mean, literally, it was a beautiful way. It added tremendous value to their stocks by getting them closer to their customer, and it was a cheap way to transport them.
And you kept them fed the whole way.
And they kept them fed the whole way, right? So as the theory goes, if the cattle drives, and what killed the cattle drives was the fact that people started barbed wiring up their ranges, and so the open range died, right? And so these guys had to come up with another way to get their products to market. And of course, trains are now moving their way deeper or into Texas, right? So with the Katy kind of coming down to Denison as kind of the first connection to the Midwest. If that had happened sooner, right, where the barbed wire had got, and it became instantly popular once it was demonstrated, which was done in San Antonio, then the beef guys would have had to pivot to the idea of trying to move all their cattle by rail from, let's say, Texas. But once you start thinking that way, where you're not doing these long drives, then why not do the processing in Texas, right? Again, you're leaving a lot of value in Chicago if you're just sending your cattle up there before you slaughter them. So the processing business, which, obviously was a huge part of the value chain for beef, could have been captured in Texas if enough investment had been made in refrigeration, which again, as my theory goes, only would have happened if the range had closed maybe 10 years earlier, and people had to pivot and then make that transition to additional value chain processing in Texas with refrigerated rail cars.
And that refrigeration system, that was effectively stolen technology from the Union. Is that am I remembering that right? But am I misremembering it?
No. I mean, I think it was a fertile time for cross pollination of, but the stuff that came in to San Antonio had been purchased and just routed around the Union blockade, but not stolen.
I see.
Not Union technology. It was French. It was European technology.
Oh, okay.
At least in that instance. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Well, one other thing I heard about the barbed wire industry that I thought was kind of interesting is it was the largest steel industry on Earth, way bigger than trains and the railroad the railroad lines themselves, like way bigger. Which I thought was actually pretty astonishing how much metal we were producing for these things.
That's an amazing stat right there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's obvious how much steel went into the railroads, and to think that this would have been, and it was just this. You got out into the plains, and you ran out of all options for fencing in your property. I mean, when you were from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to whatever, that 98th parallel, there were pretty cheap ways to fence in your cattle and protect your garden and everything that you needed to do. And then you got out into that plain, and there was no way to do it until barbed wire came. And it was just one of those fundamental changes, and one of those really important adoptions that, we needed to make to kind of keep that westward movement working. Another important one being the 6-shooter, right? Which I talk about a bit in there too, or these adoptions to, technologies that worked really well further east, like those long guns. Did not translate to the plains and horseback and et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've actually seen, apparently there's a lot of collectors, not just a few, a lot of collectors of different kinds of barbed wire. And it's not like there's 1 or 5 or 10, there's hundreds of different brands with different kind of twists and...
Yeah, my father-in-law is one of those dudes.
Is he?
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
It is interesting. I mean, I thought I would not care about it at all until I looked at it. I'm like, wow, these are all very, very different.
And they all had different purposes. How aggressive they wanted to be against the cattle, and then you had to worry about what the damage they potentially do to the livestock, and and people were very, initially very suspicious that kind of pulled iron would even be able to hold back, particularly Texas cattle,
those big longhorns.
Yeah, those big longhorns. But it was quickly proven that it was effective. And as you said, the growth and the amount of metal that went in there was just phenomenal. But again, there were really no alternatives at that time. So it was
probably still to this day, to be honest.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah.
I remember one quote from the book. It was something like, "There hasn't been a cattle invented that could get through these things." It was some sales pitch.
Yeah, that was that guy. I think his name was Graves. I should look it up because he was and I didn't get into it. And I don't think I realized what a character he was. He was just a kid when he was, and somehow he talked the authorities and let them set up in the plaza down there in San Antonio, and he wrapped it with this barbed wire they had got. was it Gates? I think maybe it was Gates, but then he became known as $1 Million Gates because he'd make these $1 million bets. He was just this crazy character, you know. He went on to be a very obviously successful sales guy.
Sure.
Yeah, a lot of these, well, he wasn't a distillery guy, but a lot of guys associated with booze made a lot of early money and then moved into a lot of other businesses.
Say a lot of them's got to be moving into politics very quickly thereafter.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about your distillery.
Yep.
So first of all, tell us all about it. Like, how did you decide to get going with it? You met these people in a elevator, and then suddenly you have a distillery.
So it was another husband and wife team, and the husband, this was the Salinas'. He had a group that he had put together. He was kind of leading this gang to build a small whiskey distillery somewhere in Austin. And we were literally, the first night we went out with these guys, we just had dinner and then went to Don's Depot and listened to a little music and got a little buzz on there. And I was like, hey, Sal, if you could use one more partner, I've been kind of thinking about, something similar. And he says, yeah, sure. And then, as I think often happens when you get a new set of eyes on a business plan, you kind of start poking it a little bit. And I poked it to the point where it kind of just fell apart, And it wasn't that it was a bad idea, but it was just a little half-baked still, And at this point, as I mentioned earlier, we were kind of going 6 months. And we went back to Santa Fe, right? And I felt really bad. I was like, wow, Sal, I didn't mean to, I just was asking kind of, I think, pretty obvious questions. I'm sure to you, they would have been kind of, on kind of capacities and revenue streams and that sort of thing. And I let it sit for 6 months and then came back and reconnected and said, hey, if you're still interested, maybe we can get a new group together and, figure something out. And, they were keen on that. Both of us were kind of, amateurs, and so we decided, well, I think what most people do, and certainly we're going back to that ADI I talked about, the American Distilling Institute. They were doing a bunch of classes where you could go and learn a little bit of the business side and play around with a little bit bigger equipment. Like, you can only do so much with a little thing in your backyard or your garage or whatever. So we went and took this week-long class out in Washington State. And at that class, we met the only other Texans in the class were a father-son team. And they, one of them, the son lived in Amarillo at the time, and the father was out in East Texas in Sulphur Springs. And they were further along in a lot of the business plan kind of bits of it, but didn't have a real good location. They didn't have that experience figured out. And so we decided they might be good partners to kind of bring in as well. And so that's we brought them down to Austin shortly thereafter, kind of made the case for Austin as being the right place to try to do this. And it kind of, again, that was kind of 2012, 2013, and we kind of got that was the original group, the kind of six of us, 2 husband and wives and a father-son, and then went out, and went around to like the Central Texas Angel Network, and got a little early money from those guys, C10, and started building it that way, and kind of been chugging along ever since.
That's great. Well, Andrew, this has been amazing. First of all, where do people find your book?
You can find it at Book People if you're local. That's where I would send anybody in Austin. I'd say go support your independence. If you're in around Texas, I don't have a good list, but it's probably on my Instagram.
Well, what's that?
Which is just Andrew Braunberg.
Okay, great. All right.
And then you can get a link to my linked page. You know, all
and how do you spell that just for the audience?
Yeah, Andrew probably people got.
Yeah.
Braunberg, Braunberg.
Okay.
Yeah. And it is, of course, available on Amazon or Barnes & Noble online. So if you want to go that route and get it tomorrow, you can do it. It'll be there.
Well, I honestly think that your naysayers are crazy. This is a very fun read. I thought it didn't make Texas look bad. It made Texas come alive.
I appreciate that.
It was a very fun book. So I really appreciate you coming on the show, man.
I had a good time. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Yeah.